I am Arthur Vance, 34 years old. Last month, I walked into my own father's 70th birthday celebration at the most prestigious luxury hotel in Boston, only to be publicly humiliated. While I was standing there holding a sentimental family heirloom, my stepmother looked right at me, smiled into her microphone in front of 300 elite guests, and said, "Security, please escort him out before he embarrasses this family any further." They laughed. My father looked down at his champagne glass and let them drag me out. But there was one massive detail they didn't know. My late mother had placed the entire real estate, the historic land deed, and the $17 million empire directly into my private trust. And right now, my stepmother and my father are desperately begging outside my apartment door. Before I tell you exactly what happened, hit like if you believe in real justice. And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The November wind coming off Boston Harbor cut straight through my wool overcoat, carrying the sharp scent of salt and exhaust. I stood on the polished granite steps outside the Grand Monarch Hotel, watching the steady procession of luxury vehicles pulling up to the valet stand. A black Rolls-Royce Ghost glided to a stop right in front of me, its door opened by an attendant in a crisp white pair of gloves. A man in a bespoke Italian tuxedo stepped out, laughing confidently with his wife whose diamond necklace caught the amber glow of the entryway chandeliers. Money has a very specific sound in a city like Boston. It sounds like low, effortless laughter and the heavy, solid thud of expensive car doors closing. I looked down at my own hands. I was wearing a clean, simple black tuxedo that I had tailored myself, and in my right hand, I carried a small, polished mahogany box. Inside that box rested a piece of brass that meant more to me than every bank account represented in that building. I took one deep breath, letting the freezing air ground me, and walked through the revolving glass doors. The main lobby was breathtaking, which somehow made the ache in my chest burn hotter. Towering floral arrangements of white roses and winter eucalyptus overflowed from crystal vases on every marble table. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. I approached the check-in table, where two young women with glowing iPads were checking off names. I gave the first receptionist my name, Arthur Vance. She smiled politely, her manicured fingers scrolling down the digital screen. She scrolled once. Then she scrolled again, her eyebrows knitting together. "I am so sorry, sir. I don't seem to have an Arthur Vance on the VIP guest list." I did not flinch. I had spent 19 years preparing for this exact brand of quiet erasure. Before I could respond, an older event coordinator standing behind her leaned over, glanced at my face, and whispered something into the young woman's ear. The receptionist cleared her throat, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Apologies, Mr. Vance. You are listed under Family Overflow. Table 42, right near the terrace doors." Family Overflow. Two words that perfectly encapsulated my entire existence within the Vance household. I accepted the small silver place card without argument, adjusted my cuffs, and walked into the grand ballroom. I thought I had grown numb to the exclusion. I was about to find out that the deepest cuts do not come from strangers at the door, but from the people sitting at the head table. The grand ballroom of the Grand Monarch was a monument to manufactured history. Above the main stage, a massive high-definition screen displayed a looping presentation of the hotel's restoration. There were dramatic before and after photographs. Water-damaged ceilings transformed into gilded plaster, rotting oak floors replaced with gleaming herringbone parquet, and abandoned brick corridors turned into exclusive VIP lounges. I stood near the back perimeter, watching the elite of Boston raise their champagne flutes to applaud the photographs. Then the screen faded into a towering portrait of my father, Richard Vance, standing in a tailored tuxedo with his arms crossed. Beneath his image, bold gold lettering read, "Richard Vance, a lifetime of visionary genius." My stomach turned cold. My mother's work filled every square inch of that room, yet her face was nowhere. Her name had been thoroughly scrubbed from the narrative. Instead, my father sat at the center of the head table, basking in the applause. Beside him sat my stepmother, Victoria, draped in a silver silk gown that caught every flash of the event photographer's cameras. To her right sat her son, Preston, leaning back in his chair like a prince waiting for his coronation. Dinner concluded, and the speeches began. Preston took the microphone first, delivering a polished, hollow monologue about corporate growth, real estate acquisitions, and carrying the Vance family legacy into the next century. The crowd cheered. Then Victoria stepped up to the podium. Her voice was smooth, perfectly modulated, and dripping with rehearsed emotion. She praised my father for his bravery in rescuing Boston's architectural landmarks from ruin. She thanked the investors, the city planners, the corporate lawyers, and the marketing team. She did not mention my mother once. Something inside me snapped, but it wasn't a wild, reckless anger. It was an absolute, freezing clarity. I stepped away from the wall, gripping the mahogany box, and began walking toward the stage. I moved steadily down the center aisle. A few heads turned. My father's eyes locked onto mine, and all the color instantly drained from his face. Victoria's smile froze mid-sentence. I was 10 paces from the stage when Victoria leaned back into the microphone. Her voice remained impeccably polite, designed to sound like a concerned hostess dealing with a trespasser. "Security," she said softly over the speaker system. The ballroom went dead silent. 300 people turned in their chairs to stare at me. "Please escort this individual out before he embarrasses our family any further," Victoria added, offering the crowd a tight, sympathetic smile. 2 burly security guards in dark suits converged on me from the side wings. I stopped walking. I looked directly at my father. He was standing 3 feet away from his wife. All he had to do was reach out, take the microphone, and say, "That is my son." He didn't. He looked at me, looked at Victoria, and then dropped his gaze directly to the polished floorboards. The guard on my left gripped my elbow. "Sir, we need you to exit the premises." I kept my eyes fixed on my father's bowed head. My voice carried clearly through the quiet room. "I came tonight to give you one last chance to remember who actually built this family. Now I know you never forgot. You just chose cowardice." I placed the mahogany box gently on the nearest linen-covered table, turned around, and walked out. Behind me, Victoria laughed nervously into the mic. "I am so sorry, everyone. Some people simply cannot handle being left out of the spotlight." The night air hit my face like ice water as I exited through the valet doors. The attendants standing near the heat lamps quickly averted their eyes, pretending they hadn't just watched the chairman's son get thrown out of the building. I walked past the line of idling limousines and navigated to the far, unlit corner of the parking structure where I had left my standard American sedan. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat in the pitch black for 60 seconds. I let myself feel the full weight of the humiliation. I felt the burning in my throat, the 19 years of being edited out of family holiday cards, the Thanksgiving dinners where my career was mocked, the endless times my mother's memory had been disrespected. I let the anger burn through every nerve ending until there was nothing left but cold, hard ash. Then I reached into the passenger seat and opened my laptop. The glowing blue light illuminated the dashboard. I connected to my mobile hotspot and opened an encrypted communication portal. My phone rang on the first vibration. It was Judge Margaret Holloway. "Are you safe, Arthur?" Her voice came through the speaker, crisp and steady. "I'm in my car outside the hotel," I replied, my hands completely still over the keyboard. "They made their choice." "Then it is time to honor your mothers," she said. I opened the digital legal repository Judge Holloway had prepared. For documents sat waiting for my authorization. I typed my full legal name into the first signature line, Arthur Eleanor Vance. With that single digital keystroke, Vance Preservation Trust formally notified Vance Heritage Hospitality that the commercial operating lease for the Grand Monarch Hotel was terminated, effective immediately. I signed the second document. A direct legal transmission was dispatched to Apex Horizon Capital, the investment bank currently underwriting Preston's multimillion-dollar corporate expansion. The notice informed their senior loan officers that the primary real estate collateral listed on Preston's application was not owned by Richard Vance or his corporation. I signed the third. The City Historical Preservation Board received the original architectural deed and strict historical covenants drafted by my mother in 1998. Finally, I authorized a formal cease and desist order demanding that my father's corporation immediately halt all unauthorized commercial use of Eleanor Vance's architectural blueprints, marketing history, and design likeness. I watched the green confirmation timestamps populate across the screen. 10:14 p.m. Inside the ballroom, the caterers were likely serving dessert. They were drinking expensive champagne on top of a foundation that had just completely shifted beneath their feet. I closed the laptop and turned the ignition key. I thought the worst of the storm was over now that the legal strike was launched. I was so incredibly wrong. As I drove through the quiet, dimly lit streets of the Boston waterfront toward my apartment, my mind pulled me backward 21 years. I was 13 years old again, sitting in the passenger seat of my mother's beat-up Ford station wagon. It was 4:30 in the morning, and the city was blanketed in a thick, freezing Atlantic fog. My mother, Eleanor Vance, was an architect and a master historical preservationist. While other mothers spent their Saturday mornings sleeping in or going to yoga classes, my mother spent hers dragging me through abandoned theaters, condemned libraries, and boarded-up hotels before the demolition crews could arrive. That morning, she had brought me to the Grand Monarch. Back then, it wasn't a luxury jewel. It was a rotting, forgotten structure slated for the wrecking ball. We squeezed through a gap in the chain-link fence and stepped into the cavernous main lobby. The ceiling plaster was peeling in massive sheets, and rainwater dripped steadily into stagnant puddles on the floor. But as the first rays of morning sun pierced through the shattered glass skylights, illuminating the dancing dust motes, my mother stood there with her hands on her hips, her eyes wide with absolute reverence. She walked over to a crumbling load-bearing pillar. She scraped away a thick layer of ugly, peeling green paint with her pocket knife, revealing the solid, hand-carved limestone underneath. "Look at this, Artie," she whispered, taking my small hand and pressing my palm against the cold stone. "Never trust the paint. Paint lies. Careless people cover up masterpieces with cheap coats of gloss because they don't have the patience to understand what holds the building up. Always look at the foundation. The foundation tells the truth." I nodded, feeling the rough texture of the limestone against my skin. At 13, I thought she was just teaching me how to evaluate old real estate. I had no idea she was handing me a survival manual for dealing with human beings. My father was known around the financial district as the dealmaker. He knew how to schmooze wealthy bankers at charity galas, how to leverage corporate debt, and how to charm lifestyle journalists. But my mother had the vision. She was the one who fought the city zoning board for 3 years to save the Grand Monarch. She spent countless nights hunched over her drafting table, hand-drawing structural reinforcements to preserve the original 1910 marble archways. She didn't just design the hotel. She poured her very soul into its mortar. And every time I watched her stand on scaffolding in her steel-toed work boots, aggressively arguing with lazy contractors who wanted to take cheap architectural shortcuts, I felt an immense pride. She was building something meant to outlive us all. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, the foundation of my entire world cracked. There was no prolonged illness, no time to prepare, no final conversation sitting by a hospital bed where she told me how to navigate life without her. She suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage while reviewing structural load reports on the third-floor scaffolding of the hotel. One minute she was laughing with her site foreman about original crown molding, and the next minute she was gone. Sudden, brutal, final. The weeks that followed were a blur of suffocating darkness. Our house in Chestnut Hill was suddenly packed with distant relatives eating store-bought casseroles, speaking in hushed, pitying tones whenever I walked into the kitchen. The living room smelled suffocatingly of white lilies, a smell I still cannot tolerate to this day. I remember standing beside her mahogany casket at the cemetery. The autumn rain was soaking through my suit jacket. My father stood on my right, his large hand resting heavily on my shoulder. I looked up at his jawline, tight and pale, and I genuinely believed that our shared grief would forge an unbreakable bond between us. I thought we were the only two people on Earth who truly understood the magnitude of what had been stolen from us. I was hopelessly naive. Grief does not always bind people together. Sometimes it just creates a vacuum for someone else to fill. Exactly 6 months after we buried my mother, my father called me into his study and introduced me to Victoria Ward. Victoria did not make her entrance like a wicked stepmother from a storybook. That would have made things much simpler to fight. She arrived like an expensive, highly curated solution to my father's emotional exhaustion. She wore soft beige cashmere, spoke in a soothing, melodic whisper, and smelled of high-end French perfume. She told my father's friends that she had no desire to replace Eleanor. She only wanted to help Richard heal and manage his grueling corporate schedule. The high society wives adored her for it. They called her graceful, selfless, and emotionally resilient. But I learned within 90 days that Victoria's brand of cruelty did not require volume. She didn't need to raise her voice to destroy someone. She only needed to rearrange the furniture. Accompanying Victoria was her 17-year-old son from her first marriage, Preston. Preston was 2 years older than me, tall, conventionally handsome, and possessed the effortless arrogance of someone who had never worked a hard day in his life. Within 4 months, he was calling my father Dad at Sunday brunches. Within 6, my father had paid off Preston's private school tuition and established a generous college fund for him at Harvard. I watched a stranger step into my house and effortlessly breathe my air. The erasure of my mother happened in calculated, incremental steps. First, my mother's framed architectural sketches were taken down from the main hallway. Victoria gently explained to the housekeeper that looking at the blueprints made my father dwell too heavily in the tragic past. Next, my mother's massive oak drafting table was unceremoniously disassembled and dragged out into the detached garage because Victoria wanted to convert the sunroom into a bright, airy space for her morning Pilates instruction. Her collection of rare historical preservation books was packed into cardboard Walmart boxes and shoved into the damp basement. Her favorite armchair was reupholstered in sterile gray velvet. Every time I tried to object, my father would look at me with exhausted, bloodshot eyes and say, "Artie, please. Victoria is just trying to make this house feel like a home again. Don't make this harder than it already is." By the time I turned 18, the transformation was complete. At family holiday gatherings, Victoria would stand near the fireplace with her hand resting proudly on Preston's shoulder, introducing him to corporate executives as Richard's boy. When she introduced me, her smile would tighten imperceptibly. "And this is Arthur," she would purr. Eleanor's son. Eleanor's son. Not Richard's son. A leftover. A ghostly remainder of a previous corporate merger. The defining moment of my disillusionment occurred during our Thanksgiving dinner when I was 21. I was in my junior year at Cornell, studying structural engineering and historical preservation. I had just completed a grueling summer internship restoring a 19th-century church bell tower. My hands were calloused, and my fingernails still carried faint traces of masonry dust. Preston, who was currently coasting through a generic business degree while living in a luxury high-rise condo paid for by my father, swirled his expensive red wine and chuckled across the turkey. "So, Artie," Preston smirked, making sure the entire table of extended relatives was listening, "I hear you're still playing around with bricks and mortar. You actually restore old buildings physically? Like, with your own manual labor?" A few of Victoria's affluent cousins snickered into their linen napkins, treating honest, physical work as if it were an embarrassing character defect. I looked at my father, waiting for him to shut Preston down. I waited for the man who owned Vance Heritage Hospitality to explain that without manual labor and structural engineering, his luxury hotels would collapse into the street. My father offered a weak, apologetic smile, picked up his silver carving knife, and looked down at his plate. He sliced the turkey in complete silence. That was the exact moment I realized my father was dead to me. 3 weeks later, Preston parked his brand new silver Porsche 911 Turbo S, a graduation gift from my father, directly in the center of the front circular driveway. I packed my belongings into my sedan, moved into a cramped studio apartment near the university, and never asked my father for a single dollar of financial support again. 12 years slipped by. I built my career far away from the glittering corporate boardrooms of Vance Heritage Hospitality. I earned my master's degree and became a respected structural engineer specializing in historical preservation across New England. I worked on leaking community theater roofs, crumbling municipal libraries, and weather-beaten maritime museums. The pay wasn't extravagant, but every time I saved a historic building from being demolished by greedy commercial real estate developers, I felt an intense, spiritual connection to my mother. I was continuing the work she left unfinished. Meanwhile, Preston Sterling ascended the corporate ladder of my father's empire with meteoric speed. Armed with a generic MBA and an inflated ego, Preston was appointed vice president of strategic growth before his 30th birthday. My father gifted him a sprawling corner office overlooking Boston Harbor. Preston didn't know the first thing about architectural integrity or structural load calculations, but he excelled at the performative aspects of corporate wealth. He wore tailored Tom Ford suits, drank $300 glasses of Macallan Scotch, and knew how to throw around trendy buzzwords like synergy, asset scalability, and boutique luxury curation during quarterly investor meetings. As my father's 70th birthday approached, the corporate public relations machine kicked into overdrive. Vance Heritage Hospitality announced a massive rebranding campaign centered around their flagship property, the Grand Monarch. For months, I couldn't walk past a newsstand or open a financial website without seeing my family's faces. Glossy architectural magazines published sprawling 10-page spreads celebrating the hotel's legacy. Every single article attributed the discovery, design, and preservation of the Grand Monarch entirely to my father's unrivaled entrepreneurial genius. Preston gave video interviews to real estate blogs, standing in the marble lobby my mother had mapped out by hand, boldly claiming that he and Richard had built the luxury brand from the ground up. They had successfully erased Eleanor Vance from the history books. I watched the media blitz from my small apartment, boiling with a quiet, righteous fury. I told myself that dignity meant staying silent. I told myself that engaging in a public mudslinging contest with Victoria and Preston would only tarnish my mother's memory. I genuinely hoped that during the upcoming milestone birthday gala, my father would finally experience a pang of conscience. I hoped he would stand at the podium, look out at the media, and say, "Actually, none of this exists without my late wife, Eleanor." I was still clinging to the pathetic hope that my father loved the truth more than he loved his own comfort. My 34th birthday arrived on a rainy Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks before the scheduled gala. There was no family dinner. There were no balloons, no birthday cake, and certainly no surprise visit from my father. My phone buzzed once on my nightstand at exactly 8:14 in the morning. It was an automated text message from my father. "Happy birthday, Artie. Hope the engineering projects are going well." Artie. He hadn't called me that out loud since I was 15 years old. I stared at the cold, sterile text for 3 minutes before typing a 2-word reply. "Thanks, Dad." I didn't write anything else because asking for emotional warmth from Richard Vance was like trying to draw water from a dry well. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment after a long day inspecting a compromised brick foundation in South Boston. I grabbed my stack of mail from the rusty metal box in the lobby. Slipped between a routine electric bill and a promotional flyer for a local grocery store was a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope. The paper quality immediately caught my attention. It was 100% archival cotton stock, formal and expensive. I turned it over. Printed neatly in the top left corner was the return address. Holloway and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Beacon Hill, Boston. I looked at the addressee line. Typed across the center in crisp, black elite font was my full legal name, Arthur Eleanor Vance. My heart skipped a beat. Nobody included my middle name on official correspondence. Victoria had practically made it a household crime to utter the name Eleanor. Seeing it printed there, bold and undeniable on legal stationery, felt like receiving a physical tap on the shoulder from someone standing right behind me. I slid my thumb under the flap and broke the heavy wax seal. Inside rested a single sheet of matching cotton letterhead. The message was brief, but the weight of the ink felt monumental. Dear Mr. Vance, your late mother, Eleanor Val Vance, left explicit legal instructions directing our firm to contact you immediately upon your 34th birthday regarding the controlling ownership structure of the Grand Monarch Real Estate and its associated assets. Please contact our office to schedule an immediate private consultation. Sincerely, Judge Margaret Holloway, Senior Managing Partner. I read the paragraph 3 times, my breathing slowing down until the only sound in my kitchen was the hum of my refrigerator. My mother, my 34th birthday, controlling ownership structure, the Grand Monarch. Those concepts did not belong in the same sentence together. For 19 years, I had operated under the assumption that my mother had died intestate, leaving my father to inherit everything through standard marital succession. I grabbed my cell phone with hands that were suddenly much steadier than my pulse. I dialed the number listed at the bottom of the page. A receptionist answered, transferred me securely, and less than 15 seconds later, an elderly woman's voice came through the line. Arthur, Judge Holloway said gently, I have been keeping this calendar alert for 19 years. We have a great deal to discuss. The following morning at 9 o'clock, I walked into Judge Holloway's corner office on Beacon Hill. The room smelled of polished mahogany, aged legal parchment, and sharp lemon oil. Floor-to-ceiling leather-bound law reviews lined the walls, giving the space the hushed, sacred atmosphere of a cathedral. Judge Margaret Holloway was 72 years old, possessing piercing hazel eyes and silver hair cropped into a sharp, authoritative bob. She wore a tailored navy blue suit and sat behind a massive executive desk. She didn't offer superficial pleasantries. She slid a thick, dark blue archival binder across the desk toward me. Your mother was the most brilliant, meticulous client I have ever represented in my 40 years of practice, Judge Holloway said, tapping the cover of the binder. She loved architectural beauty, Arthur, but she understood that in the corporate world, enforceable legal documentation matters far more than aesthetic vision. I opened the cover. The first document was a certificate of trust incorporation dated August 14, 1998, 2 months before my mother died. The entity name was printed in bold, Vance Preservation Trust. What is this? I asked, looking up. This is the actual owner of your family's empire, Judge Holloway explained calmly. For 19 years, your father and Victoria have operated under the public delusion that Vance Heritage Hospitality owns the Grand Monarch Hotel. They do not. The operating corporation merely leases the commercial space. Before her death, your mother transferred the fee simple absolute land deed, the historical building structure, the architectural copyrights, and the entire $17 million real estate evaluation directly into this irrevocable trust. The air left my lungs. And who controls the trust? Upon your 34th birthday, Judge Holloway said, leaning forward, 100% of the executive trusteeship transferred exclusively to you. Richard Vance operates his flagship luxury hotel solely at your discretion. I stared at the paperwork, my mind racing through the implications. Did my father know about this? He signed the legal acknowledgement receipt 3 weeks after her funeral, she replied. Then why hasn't Victoria tried to break the trust? I asked. She has her own team of aggressive corporate divorce lawyers. She would never let $17 million sit outside her grasp. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. She flipped to the back section of the binder, pulling out a separate, recently obtained legal addendum. This is the second reason I summoned you today, Judge Holloway said, her tone hardening. Victoria Ward has spent the last 6 months aggressively lobbying corporate attorneys to restructure the hotel assets before your father's 70th birthday gala. She intends to merge the hotel real estate directly into Preston's new holding company. She can't do that, I said. The property belongs to my trust. She couldn't do it alone, Judge Holloway corrected. She needed a secondary family executor to sign a formal waiver of supervisory oversight to bypass the trust probate review. She slid a document across the desk. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the waiver. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. There, signed in fluid, undeniable black ink, was the signature of my father's younger brother, my Uncle Jonathan Vance. Jonathan, the uncle who used to take me fishing after my mother died. The man who always patted my back at family reunions and whispered, "I'm looking out for you, Artie." Jonathan accepted a private real estate transfer, a luxury beachfront compound in Nantucket, from Victoria's personal equity fund 3 weeks ago. Judge Holloway revealed quietly. In exchange, he signed this fraudulent affidavit certifying that your mother's trust was dissolved by mutual family consent in 2005. They planned to announce Preston's acquisition of the hotel during the gala speeches. My own flesh and blood had sold my mother's legacy for a vacation house. I gripped the edges of the mahogany desk until my knuckles turned stark white. The betrayal burned through my veins like acid. They think they found a legal loophole, Judge Holloway observed, watching my face. They haven't, I said, my voice dropping an octave. They just signed their own corporate death warrant. 3 weeks before the gala, I drove my sedan up the winding asphalt driveway of my father's waterfront estate in Chestnut Hill. I hadn't set foot inside that house in over 3 years. Sitting on the passenger seat beside me was a custom-made, dark mahogany box lined with crushed navy blue velvet. Inside the box rested the original, heavy brass master skeleton key from the front reception desk of the Grand Monarch. My mother had kept it as a good luck charm during the 1995 restoration. I had spent the previous evening carefully polishing the tarnished metal until my mother's engraved initials, Evie, gleamed brightly on the handle. On the top lid of the wooden box, I had hired an engraver to carve 4 simple words. Eleanor saw it first. I wasn't bringing the key as an act of war. I was bringing it as a final, desperate moral litmus test. I wanted to look my father in the eye in the privacy of his own home and give him one last opportunity to choose his blood over his corporate image. The housekeeper let me in. I found my father sitting behind his desk in his private first-floor study, reviewing quarterly financial spreadsheets. He looked older than 70. His hair was completely silver, and deep, exhausted lines etched the corners of his mouth. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway holding the box, he blinked in genuine surprise. "Arthur, you didn't tell me you were coming over. Early birthday present, Dad?" I said quietly, stepping into the room. I placed the mahogany box directly over his financial reports. My father reached out. His thick fingers trembled slightly as he unlatched the brass clasp and lifted the lid. He stared down at the heavy skeleton key. For 3 seconds, the hardened corporate CEO vanished. I saw the young man who had loved my mother, the man who used to bring her black coffee while she drew blueprints at midnight. "The Monarch Master Key," my father whispered, his voice cracking. "God, I remember the day Eleanor brought this home." Before I could speak, the heavy oak door of the study pushed open wider. Victoria glided into the room, holding a glass of sparkling water. Her sharp hazel eyes darted from my face, down to the open wooden box, and finally to my father's emotional expression. Instantly, her posture stiffened. The temperature in the study plummeted. "Oh, Arthur, what a sentimental little trinket," Victoria purred, taking 3 calculated steps toward the desk. She placed her manicured hand possessively over my father's shoulder. "But Richard really has more than enough antique clutter gathering dust around here. We are entirely focused on Preston's future asset expansion now. We can't afford to be weighed down by ancient history." I didn't look at Victoria. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my father's eyes. "Say something," I willed him silently. "Tell your wife that this is your late wife's legacy. Tell her to step back." My father swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He looked up at Victoria's tight, warning smile. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and shut the lid of the mahogany box. He slid it to the far corner of his desk, away from his paperwork, like a toxic hazard he was afraid to touch. "Thank you for the thought, Arthur," my father said flatly, picking up his reading glasses. "I'll have the staff put it in storage." I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the house. The moral test was over. My father had failed. 2 days later, the second unexpected complication of the week knocked on my apartment door. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. When I opened the door, I found my ex-girlfriend, Chloe Bennett, standing in the hallway holding a cardboard carrier with 2 artisanal coffees from my favorite local cafe. Chloe and I had dated for 2 years during my mid-20s before she abruptly left me for a wealthy commercial real estate broker. She was ambitious, socially calculating, and desperately obsessed with climbing into Boston's elite high society. "Artie," Chloe beamed, stepping into my small living room before I could invite her inside. "I saw your name in the Regional Engineering newsletter yesterday. You won the Historical Preservation Award for the Maritime Museum. I just wanted to come by and celebrate with you." I kept my face completely neutral. "Thank you, Chloe. But I'm actually in the middle of preparing some contract reports." "Oh, don't be such a workaholic," she pouted playfully, setting the coffees down on my small kitchen counter. "Take a 5-minute break. I brought your favorite dark roast." I watched her body language. Her eyes weren't looking at me. They were rapidly scanning my living room, lingering heavily on the open leather archival binder sitting on my dining table. The exact binder Judge Holloway had given me containing the Vance Preservation Trust lease agreements. "Let me grab some napkins," I said, turning my back and walking into the narrow galley kitchen. I didn't grab napkins. I stood perfectly still near the microwave, watching Chloe's reflection in the dark, mirrored glass of the appliance door. The moment my back was turned, Chloe's playful demeanor evaporated. Her face turned cold and focused. She practically lunged toward my dining table. She pulled her sleek iPhone out of her designer purse, held it over the open trust documents, and rapidly snapped 3 high-resolution photographs of the property deed descriptions. I watched her thumbs fly across her phone screen as she attached the images to an encrypted text message. She hit send, slipped the phone back into her purse, and casually strolled back toward the kitchen counter. Victoria sent her, I realized instantly. Victoria knew I had met with Judge Holloway, and she had recruited my opportunistic ex-girlfriend to act as a corporate spy to assess what legal ammunition I possessed. I took a slow breath, letting a cold, dark amusement wash over me. Chloe hadn't photographed the Master Trust Incorporation documents. She had photographed a secondary, outdated draft lease agreement from 1996 that happened to be sitting on top of the stack. A draft that lacked the binding 1998 irrevocable fee simple transfer clauses. I walked back into the living room, handed Chloe a paper napkin, and picked up my coffee mug. "Thanks for stopping by, Chloe," I said, offering her a warm, appreciative smile. "It really means a lot that you remembered me." "Of course, Artie," she smiled sweetly, patting my arm. "You're going to do great things." She left 10 minutes later. The moment the latch clicked shut, I checked my computer monitor. Chloe had transmitted the photos to Victoria Ward's private cell phone number. Victoria now believed I possessed an incomplete, legally flawed lease agreement that her divorce lawyers could easily crush in court. I sat down at my desk and took a sip of the dark roast coffee. I didn't interrupt the espionage. When you are setting a trap for an arrogant predator, the most lethal weapon you can give them is the false confidence that they are winning. The final 48 hours leading up to the 70th birthday gala felt like the quiet, pressurized calm inside the eye of a Category 5 hurricane. I spent Friday afternoon sitting in the secure conference room of Holloway and Associates. Judge Margaret Holloway and I meticulously assembled the 4 ultimate digital strike packages. We verified the electronic routing numbers for Apex Horizon Capital's Executive Credit Division. We confirmed the direct email liaisons for the City of Boston's Commissioner of Historical Preservation. We double-checked the statutory filing timestamps for the Suffolk County Superior Court Real Estate Injunction Server. Every single legal document was bulletproof. There were no loopholes, no ambiguous clauses, and no room for corporate settlement negotiations. "When you transmit these authorizations tonight," Judge Holloway said, resting her folded hands over the master trust binder, "Vance Heritage Hospitality will technically become an insolvent corporate entity within 24 hours. Preston's expansion loan defaults immediately upon loss of primary collateral. Your father will face personal fiduciary liability from his board of directors. They built a $17 million house of cards on top of my mother's grave, I replied, my voice calm and measured. I am simply clearing the lot. Judge Holloway looked at me with a profound, solemn pride. Your mother would be deeply proud of the man you became, Arthur. You have her spine. I drove back to my apartment as the autumn sun dipped below the Boston skyline, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the harbor. At 7 o'clock that evening, I stood in front of my narrow bathroom mirror, preparing for the gala. I dressed deliberately. I put on the crisp white pleated shirt, fastened the black silk bow tie, and shrugged into the tailored black tuxedo jacket. Then I reached into my top dresser drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside rested a pair of antique, platinum-set mother-of-pearl cufflinks. They had belonged to my mother, the only piece of her fine jewelry that Victoria hadn't managed to intercept and pawn off or reset into her own collection. I slid the platinum posts through my French cuffs and snapped them shut. The cool metal pressed against my wrists like a physical suit of armor. I walked over to my dining table and picked up the polished mahogany box containing my mother's brass master hotel key. I tucked it securely under my arm. I walked to the window and looked out through the glass. 3 miles across the dark water of the harbor, the exterior floodlights of the Grand Monarch Hotel blazed brilliantly against the night sky, illuminating the historic 1910 limestone facade my mother had rescued with her own bare hands. They were opening the ballroom doors right now. They were pouring the champagne, adjusting their designer gowns, and preparing to toast a stolen legacy. I checked my watch. 7:30 p.m. I turned off my apartment lights, locked the door behind me, and took the elevator down to the garage. I wasn't driving to that gala to beg for my father's love. I wasn't going there to scream, throw a tantrum, or make a desperate scene. I was going there to deliver an absolute legal reckoning. And when the truth finally rose up through the floorboards, everything they had built on silence was going to collapse. Let us return to that glittering ballroom on the night of my father's 70th birthday gala. But this time, let us look at it through the lens of everything that led me to that exact moment. When I stepped out of my sedan in the far corner of the parking structure and walked toward the grand entrance, I wasn't just walking into a party. I was walking into the physical embodiment of my mother's stolen life. The air outside the Grand Monarch smelled of expensive cigar smoke and freezing Atlantic saltwater. A line of chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce Phantom limousines idled near the red carpet, discharging Boston's financial aristocracy. I walked past them, gripping the polished mahogany box under my right arm. My left wrist felt heavy with the antique platinum cufflinks my mother had worn at her own drafting table. When I reached the check-in desk, the floral scent of hundreds of imported white roses hit me like a physical blow. It was the exact same overwhelming floral stench that had filled our living room during my mother's funeral 19 years ago. Victoria had chosen those flowers deliberately. She had built her entire social debut on the aesthetic of my mother's death. I stood before the young receptionist, Sarah Miller, and watched her tap her glowing iPad. When she told me that Arthur Vance was not on the VIP guest list, I didn't feel a single drop of surprise. But when the senior event coordinator, Clara Jenkins, a woman who had worked for my family since I was 10 years old, whispered to put me under family overflow, I felt the final thread of my childhood snap. Table 42 was located in the dark back corner of the ballroom, directly next to the swinging metal doors of the main catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed out with a tray of roasted filet mignon, a cold draft of kitchen exhaust washed over my shoulders. I sat there in my self-tailored black tuxedo, surrounded by empty extra chairs, watching Preston's Sterling network near the champagne fountain. Preston was wearing a custom Tom Ford jacket that likely cost more than my monthly engineering salary. He laughed loudly with senior commercial real estate developers, patting them on the back, boldly accepting their congratulations for reimagining Boston's historic architecture. He stood on top of original herringbone parquet floors that my mother had spent 3 months sourcing from abandoned estates in Europe, claiming her labor as his own entrepreneurial genius. I sipped my ice water and watched my father sitting at the center of the head table. Richard Vance looked like a king holding court. He shook hands with bank executives and municipal judges, smiling warmly for the lifestyle magazine photographers. He looked completely untroubled. He looked like a man who had successfully convinced himself that his empire was built on clean corporate ambition, rather than the silent burial of the woman who had laid its limestone foundation. I sat in the shadows of table 42 and waited for the speeches to begin. I felt no anxiety. When you possess the legal authority to destroy a $17 million illusion with a single signature, you don't need to fight for a seat at the table. You own the floor beneath it. The ballroom lights dimmed, and the massive high-definition screen above the main stage illuminated the darkness. The corporate public relations video began playing. Lush, cinematic drone footage swept over the limestone facade of the Grand Monarch, followed by archival photographs of the 1995 restoration. I watched the screen intently. There were close-ups of hand-restored marble archways, intricate plaster crown moldings, and reinforced structural steel beams. My mother's architectural DNA was stamped into every single frame of that footage. Yet her face was systematically scrubbed from the montage. The narrator's deep, authoritative voice praised Vance Heritage Hospitality for its fearless vision, culminating in a towering digital portrait of my father beside the words, "Richard Vance, a legacy of visionary genius." The wealthy crowd erupted into polite, cultured applause. They raised their crystal champagne flutes to toast a manufactured lie. Then Preston stepped up to the podium. He gripped the edges of the mahogany stand and delivered a slick, arrogant address about corporate asset scalability, boutique branding, and how he and Richard were preparing to acquire 3 new historic properties across New England. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man whose college fund, luxury penthouse, and corporate promotion had been handed to him on a silver platter. When Preston finished, Victoria glided to the microphone in her shimmering silver silk gown. The ballroom went hushed. She spoke in that signature soft, melodic whisper, the same deceptive tone she had used 19 years ago when she told my father to move my mother's drafting table into the garage. She thanked the corporate attorneys, the investment bankers, the municipal zoning boards, and the marketing directors. She thanked everyone on earth except Eleanor Vance. I picked up the polished mahogany box from table 42, stood up, and stepped into the center aisle. I walked slowly, my black leather shoes making no sound against the thick banquet carpeting. As I passed the VIP tables, corporate CEOs and high society wives paused mid-conversation to look at me. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the head table. My father saw me first. His silver hair caught the stage lights, but his face turned the color of wet ash. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. Beside him, Victoria noticed his paralyzed expression and turned her sharp hazel eyes toward the aisle. When she saw me carrying the antique wooden box, her polished hostess smile instantly hardened into a mask of pure, venomous panic. I was 10 paces from the stage steps when Victoria leaned directly into her microphone. Her voice remained chillingly calm, projecting through the massive ballroom speakers. "Security," she said softly. 300 wealthy guests turned in their seats, their diamond jewelry flashing in the dim light as they stared at me. "Please escort this individual out before he embarrasses our family any further," Victoria added, offering the audience a tight, condescending smile. 2 massive security guards in dark tactical suits stepped out from the backstage wings and blocked my path. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the video projector above us. I stopped walking. I looked 3 feet to Victoria's left, directly into my father's eyes. He was the controlling chairman of the corporation. He was the patriarch. All he had to do was stand up, take the microphone from his wife's hand, and say, "Stop, that is my son." My father stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then his shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened, and he dropped his eyes directly down to his linen placemat. He chose his corporate comfort over his own flesh and blood. The guard on my left gripped my arm. "Sir, let's go." My voice carried clearly across the silent VIP tables. I came tonight to give you one last chance to remember who actually built this family. Now I know you never forgot. You just chose cowardice. I set the mahogany box gently on the edge of the nearest table, turned around, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, Victoria laughed nervously into the mic. I am so sorry, everyone. Some people simply cannot handle being left out of the spotlight. The freezing November wind slammed into my chest as I pushed through the revolving glass doors. The valet attendants stood rigidly near their heat lamps, staring intensely at the asphalt to avoid looking at the chairman's son, who had just been thrown out like a trespasser. I walked past the gleaming row of parked Ferraris and Lamborghinis, crossed the dark perimeter of the lot, and unlocked my sedan. I sat in the driver's seat and let the silence envelop me. For one full minute, I processed the absolute finality of what had just occurred. The 19 years of psychological conditioning, the Thanksgiving insults, the erasure of my mother's identity. It all crystallized into a hard, unbreakable diamond of rational purpose. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat and connected to my encrypted portal. Judge Margaret Holloway's secure digital repository was open and waiting. I selected the first statutory strike authorization. I typed my legal signature, Arthur Eleanor Vance. Instantly, a statutory notice of commercial lease termination was executed and logged with the state registry. Vance Preservation Trust formally revoked Vance Heritage Hospitality's right to occupy or operate the Grand Monarch real estate. I executed the second document. An automated legal injunction was transmitted directly to the Executive Credit Committee of Apex Horizon Capital, the financial institution currently underwriting Preston's multimillion-dollar commercial expansion. The injunction notified their managing directors that the primary real estate asset listed as corporate collateral on Preston's loan application was legally owned by an independent trust, rendering his financing application fraudulent. I signed the third authorization, dispatching my mother's strict 1998 historical preservation covenants to the city zoning commissioner. Finally, I authorized the immediate service of a corporate cease and desist lawsuit demanding the cessation of all commercial exploitation of Eleanor Vance's architectural designs. I watched the server confirmation lights blink green across my dashboard. 10:14 p.m. The legal foundation beneath my father's empire had officially fractured. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. I shut down my laptop, started the engine, and drove out of the hotel lot. I navigated the quiet streets toward my apartment on the edge of the city. I didn't rush. I drove at the exact speed limit, watching the harbor water reflect the amber streetlights. When I walked into my kitchen, I placed my coat on a chair, filled my kettle with water, and set it on the stove. Only then did I pull my cell phone from my pocket and disable the airplane mode I had activated before entering the Gala. The phone immediately began vibrating so violently it nearly slid across the granite countertop. The notification screen illuminated the dark kitchen. 68 missed calls. There were 22 missed calls from Victoria, 19 from Preston, 15 from my father, 12 from Uncle Jonathan. Text messages poured into my screen in rapid, frantic bursts. Arthur, what the hell did you just do? My senior loan officer from Apex just called my personal cell at the head table. Call me back right now. You vindictive little bastard, you are destroying this family. Artie, please pick up the phone. We need to sit down and discuss this rationally. I poured my boiling water over my dark tea leaves and leaned against the sink, sipping my tea in absolute tranquility. For 19 years, I had been the one waiting by the phone. I had been the one hoping for an invitation, hoping for a text message that wasn't sent by an automated calendar system. Now, the entire corporate hierarchy of Vance Heritage Hospitality was experiencing total panic. At exactly 11:41 p.m., the sharp, insistent buzz of my apartment doorbell rang through the hallway. I walked over to the wall monitor and checked the security camera feed. Standing outside my door in the narrow, brightly lit apartment corridor were Richard, Victoria, and Preston Vance. Their bespoke gala attire looked disheveled. Victoria's silver shawl was slipping off her shoulder. Preston was gripping his iPhone with white knuckles, and my father's black bow tie hung undone around his collar. They looked like defendants arriving at a courthouse after the guilty verdict had already been read. I unbolted the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could say a word, Victoria aggressively pushed past my shoulder into my small foyer. Her face was flushed, her designer makeup smudged around her eyes from pure, unadulterated rage. She marched into my living room as if she still possessed the inherent high society right to enter any space on Earth and establish dominion over it. "What have you done?" Victoria hissed, spinning around to face me. "You sent forged legal threats to our primary corporate lenders during our dessert service. You humiliated us in front of the entire board of directors." I closed the door firmly behind my father and Preston. I did not raise my voice. I took 2 steps forward and raised my right hand, pointing a single finger directly at Victoria's face. "Lower your voice," I said. "My tone is cold and dense as glacial ice. Or get out of my apartment." Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. Her mouth dropped open slightly. Preston nearly bumped into her back, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. My father stood rigidly by the coat rack, looking at me as if he had never heard that commanding cadence from me in his entire life. He hadn't. I had spent my entire adulthood making my emotional pain quiet and convenient for him to ignore. They stepped further into the room. My apartment was modest compared to their sprawling Chestnut Hill estate. There were no imported crystal chandeliers or $20,000 silk drapes, but the walls were lined with custom floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves that I had built with my own hands. Stacked neatly across the shelves were hundreds of rare historical preservation texts, alongside framed engineering schematics of municipal landmarks I had successfully saved from demolition. My father walked slowly toward the center living room wall. He stared at a framed black-and-white photograph of my mother standing on the original 1995 scaffolding of the Grand Monarch. His breathing sounded shallow and ragged. Sitting in the absolute center of my small coffee table was the dark blue archival binder Judge Margaret Holloway had given me, open to the statutory fee simple deed transfer. Victoria noticed the binder. She lunged toward the table, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the legal parchment. "You stole corporate property. I have my divorce attorneys on speed dial, Arthur. We will bury you in Suffolk County Court for intellectual property theft." "I didn't steal anything, Victoria," I replied calmly, walking over to the opposite side of the coffee table. I rested my palms against the polished oak surface. "I inherited it from my mother." "Your mother died intestate," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Dad owned the hotel real estate through standard marital succession. You're trying to leverage a fake document to extort my expansion fund." "Your expansion fund is dead, Preston," I said flatly. "And so is your corporate vice presidency." I picked up the first certified statutory document from the archival binder and laid it flat across the glass tabletop. "This is the master land deed and fee simple absolute title for the Grand Monarch property," I explained Ranmock, tapping the statutory seal. "The historic land, the physical building structure, the architectural preservation copyrights, and the entire $17 million real estate evaluation belong exclusively to the Vance Preservation Trust. They were legally conveyed by Eleanor Vance on August 14, 1998. Preston snatched the heavy parchment off the table before his mother could stop him. His eyes darted frantically across the legal descriptions, his lips moving silently as he read the statutory conveyance language. His face drained of what little color remained. This doesn't make corporate sense," Preston stammered, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "Vance Heritage Hospitality manages the hotel operations. We collect the room revenues. We handle the hospitality branding. You operate a commercial business inside a building you do not own," I corrected coldly. "Your corporation is merely a commercial tenant occupying space under a revocable lease agreement. And as of 10 o'clock tonight, That lease is formally revoked. Victoria spun around, grabbing my father by the lapels of his unbuttoned tuxedo jacket. Richard, tell him this is illegal nonsense. Tell him Jonathan signed the family probate waiver. Tell him we own the real estate. My father didn't move. He didn't look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the second signature page I had deliberately placed face up on the table, the statutory receipt of trust notification bearing his own signature, executed 3 weeks after my mother's funeral 19 years ago. I looked directly at my father's silver hair. You knew. The silence in my small living room became absolute. The street noise outside seemed to vanish entirely. My father's chest heaved. He swallowed hard, his jaw muscles twitching. Then very slowly he nodded his head. Yes, he whispered, his voice hollow and broken. I knew. Victoria released his lapels as if his jacket had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled back 2 paces, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. You knew. You let me negotiate corporate asset mergers with Apex Horizon for 6 months, knowing we didn't hold the underlying real estate title. Eleanor created the trust to protect the architectural integrity of the hotel. My father muttered, staring at the floorboards. I thought if we kept the commercial lease active, the trust structure would remain dormant. I didn't think Arthur would ever activate the executive trusteeship. You thought I would stay quiet forever, I said, stepping around the table. You thought I would let you erase my mother's name from the building she gave her life to save. I laid the final statutory transmission report on the table. As of my 34th birthday, controlling ownership of the Vance Preservation Trust transferred 100% to me. That means any commercial renovation approvals, structural modifications, marketing exploitation of my mother's likeness, and commercial real estate collateral claims require my explicit, written authorization. I looked directly into Preston's terrified eyes. Your $17 million expansion loan was underwritten using real estate collateral you didn't legally control. Apex Horizon's compliance division has already flagged your corporate accounts for loan fraud. Your lenders are calling in their credit lines tomorrow morning. Preston dropped the statutory deed onto the carpet as if the parchment had physically burned his fingers. He collapsed onto my small sofa, burying his face in his hands, breathing in rapid, hyperventilating gasps. His entire manufactured corporate identity had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Victoria's elegant high society facade shattered completely. The polished hostess vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered predator. She stepped right into my personal space, her hazel eyes blazing with toxic malice. You arrogant little bastard, Victoria snarled, her voice dropping into a venomous register. You had no right to interfere with Preston's financial trajectory. We built that corporate brand. Richard gave his entire professional reputation to make that hotel a luxury destination. You built a brand on top of my mother's blueprints, I replied, my voice completely level. You stood in her lobby, accepted applause under her marble archways, and systematically erased her identity from every brochure and press release. You used her foundation to fund your son's arrogance. Victoria stepped closer, her face inches from mine. Your mother is dead, Arthur, she screamed, her voice echoing off my oak bookshelves. The room went completely still. For 19 years, that sentence would have ripped open a bleeding wound in my chest. Tonight, it didn't even scratch the surface. I looked into her furious eyes with absolute, glacial calm. Yes, I said quietly. She is dead. And somehow, from the grave, she still protected me far better than my living father ever did. My father flinched rigidly by the coat rack as if I had taken a baseball bat to his ribs. I didn't offer a single word of apology. The truth is not a malicious attack simply because it finally lands where it belongs. Victoria looked from my father's crushed expression back to my calm face. And then, in her absolute desperation to regain emotional control, the toxic truth spilled out of her mouth before she could curate or sanitize it. You were never supposed to matter this much, Victoria hissed. There it was, the absolute, unvarnished bedrock beneath 19 years of family dynamics. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't standard stepfamily friction or lingering grief. She had constructed her entire high society existence on the fundamental assumption that Arthur Vance could be marginalized, disinherited, and erased without triggering a single consequence. I nodded slowly, feeling an immense, liberating peace settle into my bones. I know. That simple two-word acknowledgement seemed to terrify Victoria far more than screaming or rage ever could. She realized she possessed no emotional leverage left to manipulate. I walked to the foyer and opened my apartment door wide. "Get out." They filed out into the hallway in complete silence. My father paused at the threshold, looking back at me with watery, pleading eyes. I shut the heavy wooden door directly in his face, threw the deadbolt, and turned off the foyer light. Over the next 14 days, the polished corporate empire of Vance Heritage Hospitality underwent a catastrophic, highly publicized unraveling. The morning after the gala, Judge Margaret Holloway formally filed the statutory lease revocation and historical preservation injunctions with the Suffolk County Superior Court. By noon, the financial press had caught wind of the statutory filings. The Boston Globe published an explosive front-page investigative report detailing how the flagship real estate of Boston's premier hospitality group was actually controlled by an independent historical preservation trust established by the chairman's late wife. The corporate fallout was swift and brutal. Apex Horizon Capital immediately froze Preston's corporate expansion accounts and issued a formal demand for the immediate repayment of their initial $3 million bridge loan. When Vance Heritage Hospitality failed to produce clean real estate collateral, the bank initiated commercial insolvency proceedings. The corporate promotional videos celebrating my father's visionary genius were abruptly scrubbed from the company website. The City Historical Preservation Board launched an immediate municipal investigation into 18 years of corporate marketing materials that had illegally utilized Eleanor Vance's copyrighted architectural blueprints without attribution. Institutional shareholders panicked. Emergency board meetings were convened in the financial district. 10 days after the gala, Vance Heritage Hospitality issued a terse corporate press release announcing that Richard Vance had stepped down as chairman and CEO. The media release framed his departure as a planned retirement to focus on family health. It wasn't a retirement. It was a chaotic corporate retreat. Preston was unceremoniously terminated by the interim board of directors. His company-issued credit cards were canceled, and his luxury penthouse lease in the Seaport District was allowed to lapse. I didn't celebrate their financial destruction. I simply went to work every day, coordinating with structural architects to begin planning the authentic historical restoration of the Grand Monarch's compromised interior corridors. 2 weeks after my father resigned, Victoria Ward packed her designer wardrobe into moving vans and vacated the sprawling Chestnut Hill waterfront estate. Through the tight-knit Boston legal community, Judge Holloway learned that Victoria's aggressive divorce attorneys had formally filed for dissolution of marriage in Suffolk County Court. Victoria abruptly relocated to Savannah, Georgia, moving into a private gated compound owned by one of her affluent college friends. Before the estate was put up for commercial liquidation, my uncle Jonathan, desperate to salvage some fragment of his relationship with me after his fraudulent probate waiver was exposed, sent me a long, rambling confession letter. Slipped into the final paragraphs of his letter was a psychological revelation that reframed the entire 19-year domestic war. Jonathan revealed that for nearly 2 decades, my father had kept a small, third-floor attic studio in the Chestnut Hill house, securely locked with a deadbolt. Victoria was strictly forbidden from ever possessing a key to that room. Inside that locked attic, my father had preserved my mother's original drafting lamps, her old masonry tools, and dozens of framed personal portraits of Eleanor. Victoria had spent 19 years living inside a sprawling luxury mansion, deeply consumed by toxic, obsessive jealousy over a locked room she could never enter. She had realized early on that she could never truly eradicate Eleanor Vance from my father's subconscious mind. And so, in her bitter frustration, she had systematically weaponized the domestic environment to punish the living, breathing manifestation of Eleanor's legacy, me. Understanding Victoria's secret psychological insecurity didn't make me forgive her abuse, but it stripped away her power entirely. She wasn't a triumphant high society matriarch. She was just a deeply insecure woman who had spent 2 decades fighting a losing battle against a ghost. The day before his corporate phone number was permanently disconnected, Preston sent me one final text message. "You destroyed this entire family." I stared at the screen for 10 seconds before typing my final reply. No. I simply removed the lie that was holding it up. Then I blocked his number forever. 3 months after the gala, on a crisp, freezing morning in early February, I stood inside the cavernous main lobby of the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The winter sun was just beginning to crest over the freezing waters of Boston Harbor, sending brilliant shafts of amber light streaming through the soaring 1910 arched glass windows. The golden light spilled across the hand-restored herringbone parquet floorboards, the exact floorboards my mother had fought the city zoning board to protect 21 years ago. There were no crystal champagne towers. There were no high society event photographers snapping flashbulbs. And there was no Victoria standing at a podium in silver silk curating the narrative. There was only a small, intimate gathering of people who genuinely understood the sacred value of historical foundation. Judge Margaret Holloway stood beside me in her heavy winter coat. To her left stood Thomas Wright, a 65-year-old master stone carver who had worked directly on my mother's scaffolding during the original 1995 restoration project. Beside him stood Dr. Robert Hayes, chairman of the Municipal Historical Preservation Board. We stood together near the base of the grand central marble staircase. Mounted directly into the hand-carved limestone pillar facing the entryway revolving doors was a large bronze architectural plaque, securely covered by a simple white linen cloth. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the limestone beneath my boots. For 19 years, I had walked through this lobby feeling like an unwelcome trespasser in my own family history. Today, the building breathed my mother's air. I stepped forward and took the corner of the white linen cloth. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pulled the fabric away from the limestone pillar. The morning sunlight caught the polished bronze surface of the newly minted dedication plaque. I stood there, letting the tears blur my vision, refusing to wipe them away as I read the deeply engraved lettering out loud to the quiet lobby. The Grand Monarch Hotel. Architectural landmark restored through the vision, structural genius, and dedicated labor of Eleanor Valvance. Master architect, historical preservationist, true founder. 1960 to 1998. Never trust the paint. Look at the foundation. The foundation tells the truth. For the first time in 19 years, my mother's proper identity legally and permanently belonged to the masterpiece she had given her life to create. Thomas Wright gently patted my shoulder, his weathered eyes shining with quiet pride. Judge Holloway offered me a warm, approving nod. As the small preservation committee began walking toward the lobby doors to exit into the crisp morning air, I noticed a lone figure standing near the dark shadows of the rear reception desk. It was my father. Richard Vance was wearing a simple, slightly worn navy blue wool suit. Without his entourage of corporate vice presidents, public relations managers, and glittering high society wives, he looked remarkably small. He looked like an ordinary 70-year-old man carrying the crushing weight of 2 decades of moral compromise. He waited until Judge Holloway and the architects had exited the revolving doors. Then, slowly, hesitantly, my father walked across the amberlit parquet floor toward the central limestone pillar. He stopped 2 feet away from the dedication plaque. His hands were trembling violently at his sides. He reached out and gently pressed 2 fingers directly against the raised bronze lettering of my mother's name. Eleanor Valvance. My father's shoulders began to heave. A low, ragged sob broke out of his chest, echoing softly through the empty lobby. "I should have said her name out loud years ago, Artie," my father whispered, his tears spilling down his weathered cheeks onto his coat collar. "I should have stopped Victoria the very first day she touched Eleanor's drafting table. I was so damn afraid of the conflict. I was so afraid of being alone." "Yes," I replied, my voice calm and steady. You should have. My father turned his bloodshot eyes toward me. Is there any way I can still try to make this right with you? I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I saw the extraordinary corporate cowardice that had allowed my childhood to be marginalized. I saw the weak compromise that had let strangers disrespect my mother's memory. But I also saw an old man who was finally standing directly in front of the unvarnished truth, rather than dropping his gaze down to his dinner plate. You can start, I said clearly, by never looking away from her name again. My father nodded slowly, wiping his face with his handkerchief. I did not offer him absolute forgiveness that morning. Forgiveness is not a statutory commodity that people automatically earn simply because their accumulated guilt finally catches up with them. But I allowed him to stand quietly beside me in the sunlight shining through the limestone archways my mother saved. And for that morning, that was enough. I still retain 100% executive control over Vance Preservation Trust and the Grand Monarch property today. I didn't execute those statutory legal strikes because I harbored a toxic desire for personal revenge. I did it because my mother spent her entire professional existence building structures that were fundamentally designed to endure. She understood that superficial gloss can easily deceive the human eye. She knew that cheap coats of corporate paint can cover up structural rot. And she knew that manipulative people can weave elaborate networks of polite silence to erase uncomfortable truths. But structural foundations do not lie. When you strip away the multimillion-dollar rebranding campaigns, the high society galas, the luxury cars, and the fraudulent probate waivers, the underlying bedrock will always demand its rightful place. And when the unvarnished truth finally rises up through the floorboards, every single hierarchy constructed on cowardice inevitably collapses into the dirt. Thank you so much for listening until the very end. If Arthur's story touched your heart, reminded you of your own family struggles, or made you think about standing up for your own dignity, please leave a comment below. I deeply love to read your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so we can meet again in the next journey. Remember, never let anyone paint over your truth. Goodbye for now, and take good care of yourselves.